All right, in this next section 2b, we're going to be looking at the time of Jesus. So just as we discussed the historical, spiritual, and literary context of the Old Testament, we must do the same for the New. So here we will examine its historical context. So we talked a little bit about the books of the New Testament, how we understand and interpret them, what their place is within the Scripture, and now we're going to look at the actual time and place, the history that the New Testament was written in. First century Judaism. Leading up to the first century, Israel was being ruled by one superpower after another, particularly because their location was important for trade. So, for example, Egypt was an important supplier of corn to the empire. They also were strategically located militarily because they were bordered by the sea and a desert, and all military expansion had to go through this narrow piece of land. So, Israel was in a very strategic location, economically and militarily. And of course, this was all on purpose. And of course, you see here in the table below, you have a list of Israel's oppressors, ranging from the Old Testament to the New, from Assyria up to the Romans. So, the Jewish revolt, led by the Maccabees. So there was a revolt that led by the Jews, led by the Maccabees. It was incited by a man named Antiochus, or the God Manifested One, and he enforced in Judea the edict that his entire realm be one religion, law, and custom by offering a pig sacrifice to Zeus on the Jewish temple's altar. The revolt inaugurated a dynasty where the Jews ruled themselves for a time. So there was a moment in this timetable here in which a group called the Jewish Revolt of the Maccabees, led by one man, actually gained the Jews some independence from their oppressors and tried to bring the whole of their society primarily under Jewish religious law. Up until that point, at certain times in their history, Jews were either completely denied their religious customs, or there was a bit of a hybrid, and this was the state they were living in with Rome, the Roman Empire. On a civic level, on a lower level, they got to keep a lot of their religious laws, but on a higher level, a supreme level, there was a Roman law, Pax Roma, that superseded all other laws and religions. So everything had to answer, all of their customs had to answer to the Roman law. But it's helpful to know that, for a little bit later here, that at some point the Jews revolted. And the Jews successfully had autonomy for a short period, but we'll get back to that in a second. Although potentially a productive region, Judea was mostly poor. Many people worked for absentee landlords, and debt and unemployment were huge problems. N.T. Wright says, the pressing needs of most Jews of that period had to do with liberation, from oppression, from debt, from Rome. This is why they imagined their Messiah to be a military conqueror, one who would free them from their oppression and their debt to yet another foreign occupier, from yet another non-Jewish leader. Rick Watts says, Jesus' parables of landlords and tenants, of large pools of unemployed day-to-day laborers waiting for work, and of subjects owing incredible debts, clearly reflect the tenor of the times. So when Jesus describes an image of a landlord or a master of a vineyard and the people in the vineyard, his tenants, this is very much a familiar and lived and experienced reality of his Jewish audience. They understood the story because they were in it. They were a part of it. And so it had meaning. The Romans gave some religious freedom, as I said earlier, to the Jews, but they still clashed with Rome's heavy-handed and intensive appointees. 60% of the Jews lived outside of Palestine in a diaspora or a scattering group. and spoke Greek. The Palestinian Jew spoke Aramaic, some Greek, and a little Hebrew. So because Jews had had many oppressors, they were actually quite spread out. They weren't all living in the land that was promised to them. And more than that, someone non-Jewish was occupying that land. This to them was a great injustice. And why they looked forward to their Messiah restoring all the promises he made even back to Abraham. That the people would possess this land. That their numbers would be more numerous than the stars. That everything the eye could see, which was this land here, would belong to him. His descendants would own it. This is what they believed they were promised. It was a great injustice that they did not all live in it and that it was possessed by someone else. Common Jewish religious life consisted of prayers and recitation. The Shema is, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one." Recited during morning and evening prayers. There's festivals and the study of the Torah through the temple in Jerusalem or outlying synagogues. There's a very, very cool significance to the Jewish wedding at this time. I want to just take a second to describe it briefly. The Jewish wedding was seen as a symbol or a fulfillment of the promise when God was reunited to his people. So the whole celebration was a belief and expression of a future state the Messiah would bring. The marriage was seen to be a covenant relationship that embodied the hope and the everyday lived reality that they were God's chosen people and they were going to live in the land he promised. And they were going to multiply the land that he promised to them. This is what the marriage symbolized to them, is a future unity. And near the end of the marriage ceremony, they would break a piece of glass. And what that symbolized is that the couple who enjoyed covenant, peaceful, joyful bliss, unification, had to go back to reality and struggle through the lives of everyday Jews that weren't living the fulfilled promises. So I just find that a very powerful and very neat example of how Jews, in their very custom, in their very beliefs, under Roman law, still practiced these symbols of a future hope. That their Messiah would free them and give them peace and unity that they've always longed for. And the marriage ceremony symbolized that. And they even broke glass to realize the couple had to return to real life and to live out the tension that not everything is fulfilled and we live in a chaotic and broken world. I just think that's a really cool and beautiful picture of the tension that these Jews lived in. Jewish leaders clashed with Jesus because he threatened their status, reinterpreted their biblical understanding, and challenged their righteousness, presenting himself as the fulfillment of their hope. So in the table below, we have the primary Jewish belief, the Jews' racial identity, and Jesus' new interpretation. So the primary Jewish belief is that there is one creator God, not a tribal God versus a pantheism. All God or deism or gods are distant from the evil and material world. So old religion, pluralistic religion, said that there were multiple gods and the gods were living on a higher, better plane of existence, and the rest of humanity was left to the lower levels to scrounge out a menial existence, and that everything material was bad and everything spiritual was good. I touched on this briefly last session when I read to you that story of the, I think it's the Assyrian creation story, where there were many gods in the beginning of the world, and they had to destroy one another in order to create the universe. And then all of those gods who were jockeying for power finally created human beings just so they could do the work that the gods didn't want to do. Work, labor, toil, which was built into the class structure of the Roman society, was all a reflection of their spiritual belief. So a certain kind of work and a certain kind of position was considered unfavorable. It was something it was a station in life you lived for your entire existence, that your children lived. But it's because they believe in a pluralism of gods who are always fighting for something better and leaving the scraps for humans. So the primary Jewish belief was different than that. That was Roman religious belief. The primary Jewish belief was one creator God. The Jewish racial identity was in the temple, the symbol of God's presence in one place. Lots of other Roman beliefs thought that God inhabited many physical things. Pantheism, that God could be found in the natural world. The Jews said their racial identity was in that God lived in one physical place. And then Jesus' new interpretation of that was the Trinity. One God, three persons. And the Jews thought that this was blasphemy to say that Jesus is God. Remember, primary Jewish belief, one creator God. And as we read earlier, what did they pray in the mornings? Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. God was one, God was not three. God lived in a temple, he didn't live in everything. There is one God, and he does not vie for power. He controls all things, their destiny, their hope, their future. Another primary Jewish belief is Israel is God's chosen race, unique ethnically based covenant. So they believe that the nation of Israel was God's way to deal with evil in the world. Salvation was through membership in God's covenant with Israel. This is why Jews held and believed for a long time that if you wanted to become a Christian and you weren't a Jew, you had to get circumcised. Circumcision was a sign through Abraham that you were a part of God's chosen people. So this new Jewish sect that saw Jesus as the fulfillment of all the prophecies would logically assume that if you weren't Jewish, because of course Jesus was Jewish, and you wanted to become a part of this new Jewish sect, you too had to be circumcised. Why? Because they were circumcised and their fathers were circumcised. It was a symbol of their membership. That's why it's so powerful when Paul and the apostles decide that we don't need to be circumcised to be a part of God's family. It was a huge paradigm shift. These insights help us understand why these were such significant issues. And you and I today, as we go to work together in a multicultural church, we struggle through some of these things. We have cultural clashes. And sometimes we want to preserve our Filipino way of doing church, and our white North American way of doing church, and our Chinese way of doing church. And yet the scriptures ask us to consider one another better than ourselves. And we're not here to create a Filipino church. We're not here to create a white church. God did not come to earth to create a religion only for Jews. He created a belief and a faith for the whole world. So it's really cool that we are carrying on that tradition of a multicultural church. It's not about preserving church in North America. It's about being God's family and laying down our own lives for the benefit of one another. It's actually a beautiful and amazing thing that we're doing together, having a multicultural church. It's not being done in many places, and I think it's one of the major themes of the New Testament. A multicultural faith, a multicultural people for all the earth, a part of God's family, no circumcision needed. That's amazing. So Israel is God's chosen race. The Jewish racial identity was the Torah. Obedience symbolizes faithfulness to the covenant. God made a covenant. You obey the covenant, so you remain in relationship to God. They secured their salvation through law keeping, circumcision, Sabbath, and food. Jesus redefined this by the cross, mercy-based covenant for all through Jesus Christ. Jesus fulfilled the law himself for all people, not just Jews. The kingdom is now, but not a political reality, for Jesus must return to rule the earth. And then there's the primary Jewish belief of a future hope, salvation, a rebuilt temple, the obeyed Torah in perfection, and cleansed land. All political, requiring force. So their imagination of their salvation was political and forceful. They believed they were still in exile, waiting for the Messiah to vindicate and deliver them. They're a story waiting for a conclusion. The Jews' racial identity in this is the land, the physical ground, a symbol of favor and fulfillment. The New Eden. This is why it was completely unacceptable that they were spread throughout the region and that Rome occupied their land. The land symbolized their future hope. That is why that land is still a source of contention today. That's why it's still fought over. You have two main ethnicities, groups, religions, Muslims and Jews, who believe that land is rightfully theirs. The dirt matters. And it's helpful to understand how powerful a piece of dirt is to a group of people when they believe the salvation of their entire race is dependent on their occupying it and their Messiah returning to rule it. You cannot underestimate how powerful that is for Jews and how powerful that is for Muslims. It's a new Eden. It's the resurrection enabled for all God's faithful to experience this salvation. The temple, the Torah, and the land were three identifiers of boundary markers to keep God's people loyal to him. And then how did Jesus reinterpret this? It's the church. We're his body. It's spirit-led, it's missional, it's multicultural. The church is not the kingdom. It is a heralder of it. The kingdom is advanced through love, not force. So, the gospel, actually the word gospel means to proclaim the good news. The good news in the New Testament is that Jesus is the Messiah. And he is here to fulfill every promise in his life, death, resurrection, and final return, to fulfill every promise ever made to the Jews and all of mankind. And furthermore, the presence of Jesus on earth isn't merely fulfillment for the Jews, but it is an extension of grace, a gift of mercy to all of mankind, to be a part of God's restorative kingdom, the new Eden, the resurrected life. Spirit-led, missional, multicultural. Popular Jewish beliefs were a messianic lion of Judah, not a slain lamb. A kingdom established by force, not self-sacrificing love. Salvation for ethnic Israel alone, not the whole earth. And the enemy was non-Jews or apostate Jews, not demonic forces. Jews thought quite literally about their salvation. The hope of the Jews was about ending this world and going to heaven. It was not about ending this world and going to heaven, because there is virtually no evidence that Jews were expecting the end of space-time universe. They were not expecting the end of what we know to be reality. And so, the hope of Jews was not about ending the world and going to heaven. Therefore, forgiveness was not about entering an otherworldly abode, that place up there, but about God returning them from exile to establish his political kingdom on earth. The hope of the resurrection was about the faithful being able to return to earth to share in the kingdom. This was their imagined reality of their Messiah. And it's important to note that Jesus did not correct this expectation. He simply clarified how it would be occurred, how it would come about. We still expect Jesus to return to earth and make all things new, and to sit in the temple and be made king and rule over the earth. As Christians, as Gentiles, we still await this promise and this hope. But it is not merely physical. It is also physical. It is also spiritual. All right. Now we're going to look at the Greco-Roman world. For a full 300 years before Christ's birth, Greek was everyone's second culture and language. And the term for this, the reason that was true, is Hellenization, which describes the spread of Greek culture throughout the land. This provided a common language through which the gospel could spread. The Caesars, or Roman emperors, were a mixed bag of genius, cruelty, and egotism. They did provide social order, though. Pax Roma, or Roman peace, also allowed the gospel to spread. Even the Roman roads were a practical means for the gospel to advance. But imposed upon the people was Roman allegiance, emperor worship, and heavy taxes. Sometimes the taxes went up to 80 to 90%. And as we mentioned before, the reason the land of Judea was rather poor, even though it was rich in resources, is you had absentee landlords, people who owned the land and lived somewhere else, and the people who farmed the land lived with taxes of up to 80 or 90%, leaving very little for themselves to live on. This is what they were going to be liberated from. This was the state of the Greco-Roman world. Side note, in the Greco-Roman world, the authorities at the time were very aware of Jewish prophecy. They understood that the Jews, in many cases their slaves made up at least 1/3 of their population. That's a lot of slaves. Believed, awaited for a Messiah. The Roman leaders knew this. And they were afraid of slave revolts. So the Roman leadership started, at will, crucifying slaves, simply to make a point. Just in case, Jews, you thought that your Messiah was coming and you should try to revolt. And hey, remember that last time you revolted under the Maccabees? You try that again, we'll just crucify your king. And so the Roman Empire made a practice of crucifying slaves. The process of crucifying a slave was erecting a vertical bar or pile into the ground, and then laying the slave out on a horizontal bar, and then nailing through the wrist of the hand so that the weight of the body rested on the tendon and the bone so that you wouldn't tear through it. And then once they lifted you up, they pushed your feet, they crisscrossed your feet, and they pushed them up and ran a spike through both feet so that the body had just enough strength to push itself up to breathe and then to let itself down. And then you essentially suffocated. As you bled and as you became dehydrated, you did not have the strength to lift your body up, pressing against the nails in your wrists and ankle to breathe. And you suffocated, collapsing on your own lungs. If the Romans were particularly keen on making their point, saying that slaves should remain slaves and had no hope for a better future in the Roman Empire, they would whip you and make you bleed and stab your side and make you bleed and feed you vinegar water so it dehydrated you even more and you had a sick taste in your mouth and your stomach. And of course, these are all the things Jesus suffered. So you can imagine how shocking it must have been for this new Jewish sect we call Christianity to see Jesus as the king they'd all been waiting for, to come and rule in a way they never expected, to free them of an enemy they did not know, and to watch him die at the very people they thought they would be liberated from. This was the world they lived in. This was the context of the early church. This was the Greco-Roman world. They were brutal, they were power hungry, and they would kill people just to make a point. It's very interesting that the death of Jesus, our King, was in the same manner as these slaves. Says something about his servant nature towards God the Father and his will and his plans. Pauses us to reflect on how obedient we are to God. The social structure was made up of the emperor and his imperial household, an aristocracy of officials, including 600 Roman senators, landowners and merchants, and slaves. So about 1/5 to 1/3 of the population through war, by birth, as punishment, or by selling yourself into slavery, which was sometimes better off than being a freedman. So, freedman was probably the lowest class of society. Oftentimes, parents would sell children into slavery because the children would have a better life. If you were bought by an aristocratic family, you ate well, you lived in a nice house, you received care and clothing and shoes. It was actually, to be a slave was a step up. So I want you to remember, what did Paul say? We are slaves to righteousness. You and I hear the word slave, and we think of the lowest form, the lowest station in life, particularly because maybe we think of the Holocaust. We think of slavery in the United States. In fact, slavery was not the worst form of living in the Roman Empire. This is very interesting that Paul called people to be slaves. It's not the lowest form. It's not the lowest station. In fact, when a Roman general would conquer another region, so the outer skirts would be up towards Germany, the Germanic people, the Roman general would bring back a section of the slaves, and he would parade them into the Colosseum, and they would all be behind his chariot, and they would all be yoked in line, and they would be led in a procession as a parade of Rome's newest conquest. Because, of course, Rome was the light of the world. And so Romans believed that military conquest brought order to chaos. It brought light to darkness. They're going to civilize the Germanic people. And so the Roman general paraded his slaves. This is the imagery Paul is using when he writes to the church in Romans, when he talks about being a slave. You are a slave to Christ. You are a slave to righteousness. This is one of the imageries Jesus uses when he says, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." Slaves literally wore a yoke when they were paraded through. So the image was visceral. It was clear. It was tangible to the listeners at the time because their historical context was imagery for all of God's stories, all of Jesus' stories. It was better to be a slave to Christ because even the best aristocratic family of the Roman Empire was no match to being even a slave of Jesus. And the yoke you wore as a slave, even if that's the best life you could imagine for your child as a freedman, a working class person, the yoke of Jesus as king is even lighter than the best mansion you could serve in. This is the context that fed the Jews' understanding of the stories and the parables of Jesus. It's the context that fed Paul's writing. This is why history is the best subject. While the primary distinction between slaves and freedmen was that slaves were owned by their masters and therefore had no legal rights, practically there was little distinctions. Slaves of Greeks owners could own property. So slaves of Greek owners could own property, including their own slaves. Slave could own slaves and could obtain permission to take other employment in addition to their duties as slaves. Some people even chose slavery as a form of social security and sometimes as a way to get a better job or income. So when Paul, in Ephesians, I believe, tells the church how slaves should treat their masters and masters should treat those slaves. He's talking to two groups of people. At that time, the church was full of a lot of aristocratic people, well-to-do, high-end society. So Paul is saying to all of these high-level people in the church, people from high parts of society, treat your slaves differently. It says something about you as a follower of Christ that you treat your slaves better. And slaves who own slaves, you treat them just as well as your master ought to treat you, even if he doesn't. These were tangible, practical ways Paul was giving the church to live as if you were a slave to Christ. When you are a slave to Christ, you treat your slave differently. You respond to a master who is unworthy to be followed. Why? Because we are unworthy to be a follower of Christ. Because he is the best master there is. It was highly prized to be a Roman citizen, though, because it afforded greater safety, the right to vote, and easier upward mobility. Women could be citizens, but were limited in their privileges and protections. They could own property and file for divorce, but they couldn't vote. When Paul said to the Romans, our citizenship is not of earth, but in heaven. Again, he was paralleling a life with Christ versus a life in Rome. Everyone wanted to be a Roman citizen. The benefits of being a Roman citizen were very, very good. Paul, before he was Paul, was Saul, was a Pharisee, and had the rights of a Roman citizen. And in fact, we read in the book of Acts, I quite enjoy this story, where he is jailed and then beaten, and him and Timothy or someone else are singing praises, and an angel comes to them, and the whole jail shakes, and all the doors fling open, and they get up and they walk out. And then the guard is about to kill himself, right? Because in Roman law, whatever happened to the jailers, like the people in jail, that was the fate of the guard. So the guard kept his position as long as people stayed in jail. And if the people were freed, then the guard died. That was the rule. So he's about to run himself through, and Paul goes, "Don't kill yourself." And the man goes, "What must I do to be saved?" Like, clearly you have a bigger God. So he's baptized, he converts, later he baptized. Paul goes to the man's house. And then the leaders of the town come after Paul, and they're like, "What have you done?" They're freaking out. Why? Because as Jewish people, they've broken Roman law. So now what Paul has done is not only has he spoken a heresy to the Jewish people, he has escaped their imprisonment, he has broken Roman law, and now the town could feel the wrath of Pax Roma. It's a compounding problem for this town because Paul showed up. And then, of course, they were going to imprison him again. And then he pulls out the Roman citizenship card. He goes, I'm a Roman citizen, and you didn't give me a fair trial. And then all of a sudden, they're really panicked. Because not only has a Jewish heretic escaped from prison and converted the main guard, but he's broken Roman law, and now Roman law, which is the highest law of the land, they haven't even given him his just process, his due process as a Roman citizen. They didn't give him a trial. They didn't hear his case. They just beat him and threw him in jail. And Paul let them do all of this to him. It's an amazing story when you understand the historical context and you understand why the people of this town hated Paul and then just drove him out, said, "Just leave." They were so afraid of Rome. And they were afraid of this Jewish heretic. This is the world that early Christians lived in. This was the Roman world. That's why it's powerful when Paul says, our citizenship is not of this world, but of heaven. And in Philippians chapter 1, he says, in the book of Philippians, he says, born on the 8th day. He basically lays out his Roman credentials and says, it is worth nothing. He says, I had the best position in the Roman Empire. I was respected by all. As a Jew in the Roman Empire, I had the best position. It was worth nothing compared to what it means to live and serve for Christ and be imprisoned and write you this letter. It's a powerful statement for a man like Paul to say, my Roman citizenship means nothing to me. And that was the one thing all Jewish slaves wanted, was Roman citizenship. And Paul called them to something higher. And then he lived it out in his missionary journey, and he lived it out in his imprisonment and his torture and his eventual death. Culture, religion, and politics were not neatly divided in this world. Although 90% of the people were rural, Rome used urban centers as the structures to shape and support all three. 25 to 40% of the city center was the market and the forum. Public buildings such as government buildings, baths, libraries, temples, and statues of gods. The walled cities also had housing for the very wealthy. There were 26 poor homes. There were aqueducts, amphitheaters, and other social buildings. The wall was viewed as a separation between chaos and order. Cities were crowded, polluted, and noisy. It was actually hard to sleep at night because of the heavy traffic on the streets, the cobblestone streets, because most of the traffic was allowed only at night. And of course, they had carts with donkeys on axles, but there was no axle grease. So you have to imagine cattle, oxen, and donkeys down a stone street in the middle of the night, clunking on stones, and with a rotating axle of wood, just crunch, 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 crunch all night. This is just to give you an image of what it like to live in a city. It was hard to sleep because of that. And the major cities of Rome were Rome, which had 450,000 people, Alexandria, which had 250,000, and Corinth, which had 50,000. The variety of religious beliefs can be summarized in the Epicureans. Those were deists who separated the natural world from the world of the gods. There were Stoics. So these are different kind of religious beliefs. There are pantheists who saw creation and God as one and the same. Some people see the world, and it's interesting today how some people divide the world still in those two same ways. Either God is so holy, there's no way he could be a part of anything material, or that God is dispersed into many living things and can be found throughout the natural world in many places. A typical Roman household was a husband, wife, one or two, rarely 3 children, and possibly other relatives and slaves. Women married in their mid-teens, and men in their early 20s. Unmarried women lived under the protection of their father. Houses in Israel were multi-generational, often filling a small city block. So this is interesting because when Jesus said that he goes to prepare a room for us in John chapter 14, he's actually referring to one of these neighborhood homes. This is what he meant. And you and I all think of a big place up in the sky somewhere distant from here. And if you want to be critical, that kind of sounds like the Epicureans who separated the natural world from the world of the gods. If we think only of God's kingdom as something different and far away and not here, we begin to see how we think like the Epicureans, that what is holy and good is distant and what is here and natural is bad. But when Jesus said, I go to prepare a place for you, a future place, he was talking about a literal house you could look out your window and see. Heaven, God's kingdom, they are not just far off, distant places in the sky, floating mansions that we will all go inhabit. The kingdom of God will return to earth. And he'll make a new heaven and he'll make a new earth. It will be tangible. You will stand in it. You will walk between homes. This is the imagery Jesus used of that city home. Many of those homes in the city had central courtyards. There was a 60% mortality rate among children. Homes were very patriarchal, but the wives ran the affairs of the household. Divorce was simple, and adultery was commonplace. Greek society was preoccupied with sex. For those who were Epicureans, sex in a temple to a Greek god was often a means of reaching a higher plane of existence. So when sexuality is talked about in the New Testament, this is one example the listener, the reader of Paul's letters might think of, is people going off to Roman temples and having sex with prostitutes to reach some sort of state of ecstasy and to sacrifice to that higher plane of existence. It was a very wicked and perverse society. Life was cheap. Life was really cheap. Slaves were plentiful, and it was all about your position in society. This is what actually made Christianity so revolutionary at the time, is it was very unsafe and uncommon for a woman to be unmarried. It meant she was vulnerable to other men, and that she didn't have a lot of stake in the community. So we read earlier that a woman could own property, and if her husband died, she would inherit that property, but she would quickly want to marry again, so that all of that would be under the husband's name. It would give her social security. So it was quite revolutionary when Paul said, tithe and give to widows and orphans. There's no need for these women to go run into marriages. Like, their social security, their sense of security comes from the church. Give money for women to remain single who wish to remain single. There's nothing in society to keep them safe or benefit them outside of marriage. And if she wishes to take care of her children on her own, the church will support her and do so. It's very revolutionary at the time. Very revolutionary. A man named Apollodorus, he said, we have courtesans for pleasure, handmaidens for day-to-day care of the body, wives to bear legitimate children, and to be a trusted guardian of things in the house. Dionysius said the lawgiver of the Romans gave virtually full power to the father over his son, whether he thought proper to imprison him, to scourge him, to put him in chains, and keep him at work in the fields, or to put him to death. This was a father's prerogative of his son, to exalt him or to bury him. Regarding their view of children, here's an excerpt from a man from Alexandria to his wife. He says, I beg and entreat you, take of our little one, and as soon as we receive our pay, I will send it up to you. So I'll send you money. If by chance you bear a child, if it is a boy, let it be. If it's a girl, dispose of it. Get rid of her. Generally, life was slow-paced. Religion was about power. Worship was private and also public, which explains why Jews and Christians were regarded as atheists, because they did not publicly worship the gods. I don't know if you have seen this before, but especially in college football, when they're walking out the tunnel for a big game, they'll often kiss a crossbeam, which has a saying or something in Latin, or like a motto of the school, or something like victory first, whatever their pledge is. That practice actually comes from worshiping Greek gods. Before you went to a festival, before you participated in some sort of activity, you might go and burn some food, give some coin, and then, of course, you would kiss the feet of the god, hoping he would bless you in your endeavor. always find that amusing. So the culture was cruel, slavery was cruel, and circuses use people for pleasure. So, and the helpless fatalism blanketed society. So basically, life was short, life was rough, life was brief, life was about entertainment, and if you happened to be the upper class, you enjoyed the best that life had to offer and disposed of all those who served your existence. If you weren't the select few, life was pretty bleak. And so the hope of a future and a place, a home God was making for you, became a powerful, powerful attraction for people to the early church. I think you and I see that even now. There's lots of lonely, dispossessed people within the province and from without it. And it's powerful when people belong before they believe. It's a powerful thing, and I think many of you are a result of this, when we include people in family before they even really understand what family is. It was powerful then, it's powerful now. Rick Watts, all in all, it was an age of pessimism, depression. The gods seemed too distant and uncaring, and there was considerable interest in magic and in new lords from the east with their mysterious rites and secret guilds. People were looking for a sense of intimacy. The philosophy of the Stoics, the Epicureans, and the Platonists was offering a trenchant or vigorous critique of all that. So there was intellectual thought that criticized the norm, but all of this, at least for the intellectuals. So only the people who had time to sit around and question what was true might have felt some freedom from the constraints of their society, because they could sort of toy with ideas and think about the newest things as their servant brought them their food and bathed them. But if you didn't live in that upper echelon, there was no hope. There was no time to consider something better or different. It was the luxury of the wealthy.